Um, okay, well, welcome to this session. It's essentially about visualization of data and really reminding ourselves about the essence of being agile and taking us back to some of the things we may have forgotten about Agile and Scrum and Kanban. So I'm going to look at a few things, including just a brief reminder of our roots, where we come from, some metrics and how they got toxic, something about groupthink and how data helps us to get through groupthink and cognitive bias and the whole sort of soup of being human. And then three just very simple ideas of visualization charts that you're probably very familiar with, but just sort of reframed in a new way and possibly, I think, revealing quite a lot more. And then the holy grail, I think, of project management and working in software, which is how do we predict when we're going to finish and how much we're going to deliver. So Monte Carlo simulation, if you're familiar with that from a Kanban world. Troy McGuinness is going to get a few name checks this afternoon. Quite well-deserved name checks, and if you know Troy's work, then you'll recognize it, come up. And then finally, we're off to karaoke, apparently. I'm not sure what that entails, but that's where we're going after this. So just as a sort of brief reminder, if we look at the sort of core practices of Kanban, pretty much all of those, apart from maybe the one about processes, we can make visible through the data that we're generating as a team, as an organization, and so on. So just as a reminder, I mean, there's obviously the visualize bit, but if we go through to how do we improve experimentally the whole sort of hypothesis-driven development, that also really needs data. We need those feedback loops to show that we're improving. And if you come from more of a Scrum background, then and you read back to sort of Ken Schwaber's original thoughts on all of this, he can't stop talking about empirical process control, empiricism, the use of data, feedback loops, and so on and so forth. So it's right there, cooked into sort of Agile from before the manifesto. And really what we're talking about is that Agile, working in an Agile way in a chaotic environment with lots of things going on and things changing, is we need a nervous system, a sort of an Agile nervous system, something that picks up on small little signals, patterns, things that are happening, and help us to respond to those. We could call it process telemetry, so we might be putting sort of telemetry on our process, trying to sort of sense what's happening. And from Doug's talk earlier, his idea of situational awareness, so we're sort of trying to gather a sense of where are we, what do we do next, what's just happened, and remembering that we work in knowledge, we can't see what's just happened, so we have to have proxies for what's happened, and that's the data that we create. So, in the midst of all this data that we've been generating as teams, if you're using Jira or TFS or LeanKit or various other things, you are generating data, and most of it stays dark. I don't know how many of you have struggled to get the information and patterns out of your data, but it's actually quite difficult. So here's some data that's sort of been collected over a while. Any thoughts on what that might be? It does look a bit like a roadmap. A roadmap of? London, yes. But it's not a roadmap, although it's a proxy for a roadmap, which is, those are the tweets of London. So tracked over, I don't know how long, a few months maybe, and they basically mapped to parts of London. And what's a little disconcerting about it is that you can see the M25 on it, quite sort of, well, not clearly, but you at least get a hint of where the M25 is. So someone's tweeting on the motorway. But there are patterns there to be found in our data, and it's really a question of how do we sort of take them and reveal them. But one of the challenges I think we all have to overcome is that metrics have somehow become toxic. Over the years, metrics are synonymous with aspects of governance. We're reporting upwards, and it's all about sort of governance and stakeholder meetings and fortnightly status reports and all that sort of stuff. Or they've been somehow created for the process gods. We create these metrics and the process gods sort of like them, and therefore we keep doing them. Or we've gone and created a little cottage industry somewhere where PMOs are hard at work, churning away at Excel spreadsheets and creating all this sort of, all these charts. And no wonder that if you go and talk to a team member about metrics, this is the sort of thing they conjure up. They don't see them as having any sort of real intrinsic value for themselves. And thereby, we've gone and lost one of the absolutely fundamental principles and cornerstones of Agile. You know, teams should be looking for data and feedback as something that helps them, guides them, helps them improve, reduces their stress by keeping expectations aligned and so on. So we've got to sort of tackle that, and a lot of it does come down to perception. You know, you can choose to see things in different ways. You know, we could choose to see metrics as metrics, as sort of just a bold statement, or we can see them for what they really are, which is a series of feedback loops. And if you go into any aspect of Agile, whether it's Scrum or Lean Startup or Lean, you know, we're looking for cycles and feedback loops. So if we choose to see metrics in a different way, maybe we get to see them like this, and we see that the value that they offer. The other question, and a bit of a challenge to us, because I always believed in the boards and have often said so, but are we enthralled to the board? You know, do we actually rely too much on the physical board? You know, or have we foregone through this sort of physical, which undoubtedly has benefits, I'm not going to argue with that, but have we foregone some of the deeper alternative benefits that we could get from the data that we gather? Now, you can gather data from physical boards, but it is actually quite a laborious process. It involves marking cards and counting them up and putting them into something else and counting that up and so on. It's not immediate, and it's not something it's not value adding at the end of the day. And since we started Agile, we've come quite a long way. We actually have boards where you can move things across the board with your fingers. So you get all the tactile, all the sort of standing around the board bit, but you also get a data point when you move your data. So maybe we should sort of slightly revisit I don't know if any of you still are wedded entirely to the physical board, or whether you're happy to sort of debate this, but I think that we've sort of foregone quite a lot of the value that we could have been getting by sticking a little bit too much to the physical board. So one of the things that we want to do when we're talking with data is really sort of engage the business as well. So we've got a very simple chart, and this is actually building on from Chris Matz's talk and Tony Grouts earlier. You know, he talked about the sort of the rate of growth and the rate of finishing. Well, that's exactly what this is. So, you know, we're tracking scope, we're looking at completed work. This is data that's read straight out of the system, whether it's in our case Jira or TFS, but we're also sort of looking forwards. And now we've given the business something to engage with, because what we're talking about, or what I reference here, is the landing zone. So this project is going to land in that zone based on probability, which I'll come to later when we talk about Monte Carlo. But what you can see here is that there's two main levers that are going to land this project. One lever is scope, and the other lever is throughput rate. And by showing people a visualization of the project in this form, we engage immediately, well, not immediately, but we do engage the business, because they hold one of those levers, the scope lever. I'm using shorthand here when I talk about business and team, but you know what I mean. But what this is also doing is it really lives to our sort of Agile roots. You know, we welcome changing requirements even late in development, straight from the manifesto, and working software is our primary measure of focus. So here we have those sort of two statements from the manifesto, perfectly sort of represented in a visual representation of the project. So the other thing to sort of recognize is that a lot of these projects actually are quite ugly. You know, these are two examples from real life projects of our clients, and in both cases you'll see that the scope line is actually increasing at quite a rate. Now that top picture is about 25 people on 2 different software teams developing quite sort of emergent type of work. They weren't sure exactly what they were building when they started it, which isn't untypical. And the other one sort of shows a sort of lagging deployment pattern. You know, it took a long time to sort of actually launch this into anything like a live environment, and we had to do some quick adjustment on scope. Both of those are real stories of a team trying to deliver value to clients. And both of them are different, I imagine, from how you've pictured burn-up charts. You know, in my mind, a burn-up chart was a little bit like the one that Chris drew earlier, sort of relatively flat with a little bumble of sort of scope increase towards the end. Whereas actually, it's a sort of ongoing process. The other thing about this is that you can engage people early on. You can see where the project's going from relatively early on in the session. So we've got this sort of soup of humanness that we have to actually deal with when we're looking within an organization at project management. It's a soup full of things like emotions, sort of corporate structure and thinking. We've got cognitive biases in there, our preferential way of seeing things using the fast aspect of our mind, being able to sort of quickly recognize patterns and so on. And we've got groupthink. We've got really to deal with all of this, the sense of, we're all human when we're sitting in a team or in a PMO or as stakeholders trying to get a sense of where this project is, where's it going, are we on track? And unless we have something to cut through this humanness, something that we can hold on to, objective, we're going to be stuck sort of in this area. So to clear that soup, I suggest data is one of the few places you can go to which actually has something sort of tangible that you can crack open these biases. And one example of that is a sort of client of ours who are working on a very important project to them. It's absolutely core to their business. There's about 120 of them, 100 plus anyway, working on this program. And it has to go live in June. It has to go live in June. We started to work with them earlier this year. They're on Jira. And we plugged our sort of tool into their Jira and began to show them that actually it wasn't going to go live on those current trends anyway until sort of end of July, middle of July at the earliest. So the way to read that is you've got an optimistic throughput, the higher line, and you've got a sort of lower level of scope, and where those intersect gives you your sort of earliest possible date. Now, we can challenge and question both the numbers, and we did. We kept going back, and we had to refine some of the reporting to make sure that these numbers at this end actually sort of withheld and could be tested by the people in the team. Once we'd got that sort of confidence in the numbers, then that led to a really big change in the way that the company or that this particular program saw this. And this is what happened sort of the days after. You can see that massive sort of drop in scope that had to happen. Now, we can talk about minimal viable product. We can talk about what does it take scope-wise to go to market for as long as you want. But until you're actually confronted with something that nudges you out of your perception of reality and the world, you are going to keep holding on to that scope. It's the contract game. That's what we do. If we're product owners and stakeholders and so on, we're thinking we can only go to market with a scope up here somewhere. Well, one thing to notice is how that scope's been changing. Since the beginning of the year, I think that goes back to January there. The scope is not nearly flat, But if I had talked to the product owners and the business people there, in their mind, they've probably said, well, we've been talking about this scope since, early last year, so I'm sure it's the same, hasn't changed. But that's the sort of thing that can begin to happen when you have data, when you have something, and not just data. Data's dull. None of us want data. We all know it exists there. But once it's interpreted and actionable, and you can visualize it, then things happen. Quite fundamental things on multi-million-pound projects where you've got 100 plus people all buying into a way of believing where this project was going and where this project was at today. Then they had very good reasons for that. And if you went and talked to them, there would be sort of, you come to that collective understanding of where a project is for very human reasons. It's not that, there wasn't any sort of deliberate attempt to mislead anybody about it. But the decision to cut that scope is a difficult decision, and people will avoid taking it for as long as they can. Now, if you can make it obvious to them sooner that you're on the wrong trajectory, then you've got a better chance of correcting it. So we talked earlier, again, Chris talked about risk. And, the earlier you can identify you're heading in the wrong direction and the risk of missing your target is identified, the more options you have to adjust that. This is actually pretty late in the day, and to be honest, they didn't have, we didn't get this whole reporting thing up and working and probably until sort of about this point anyway. So, from a data point of view, or from a visualization point of view, they couldn't have done it earlier. So, that's the burn-up chart. But we need a lot more than just sort of pretty pictures. I think, you can either have the sort of time-warped effect of project managers and optimistic scrum masters and teams, or the scary pictures of where a project's heading. But unless you can actually interact with these charts, they still just remain pretty pictures. And just sort of give you a quick sort of sense of this. That's a live chart. It's sort of calling data live from a database. This is actually from the software, from creating the SensorDAP software. But if I click on those bubbles, I can sort of drill down. I can see all the product backlog items that are within here. I can scroll through this. I can click on one of these. I can go and open it, and I can. Oh, sorry. Right. Okay. Let me do that. Thanks. Which way are you? Hang on. I think I'm going to have to. Why can't I get out of that? Okay. So, right, there you go. Apologies. What I was showing you was that. Now I have to rescale it. And it's a pretty picture. It's driven live off the data. But what we're enabling teams to do is to click on that and drill down here and go and open that in this case TFS, but it could be Jira, and go in and change things, edit it, and work on it. Too much of the pretty pictures that we give up in report upwards are sort of static. If they're in Excel, or if they're in, even if they're in the tool itself, you can't do much with it. Here we can see how many bugs we're creating and how many are solved through time. We can also sort of show how many unestimated items we have and so on. So it makes for a more engaging chart that people sort of want to go in and look at. So more than pretty pictures. So the other thing about this is the CFD. I'm sure you're familiar with CFDs. Is how do we use data to go off and actually make the business case for, or argue for something? And here's a simple example where if you're trying to make the case for DevOps and for investment in automation and new environments and different ways of working and so on, how do you use your data, visualization of it, to make that business case? So if we look at that, better DevOps looks something like that. It's more frequent delivery into live rather than this step change into live through infrequent delivery. What you can then do is sort of map out the bits that those are the value we've not gained by delaying the launch into live. We can then use this idea of cost of delay to begin to sort of put a number on that. So if we had a feature that, let's say, is going to yield us £10,000 a week in revenue, and our delay at that point is 3 weeks, we can begin to sort of calculate, what is it that our system is costing us. So again, you could try and make that case without visualization, and it could take you a while trying to sort of explain cost of delay and where you got the data from and so on. Or you could take this to an exec board, and once you've explained the CFD a little bit, you could explain to them that that is a typical delay in our system, or whatever the system delay is. So these are ways of taking pictures and what's going on in our rather complex systems that are difficult to see and difficult to understand, to somebody who holds the money and stakeholders who are trying to decide whether to spend money on your DevOps. So I was very attached to CFDs for a long time, and I've tried to sell them to everybody. But the truth is they're quite difficult for people to get hold of, and they're very lagging. They're very much about the past and about the system behavior and stuff. So when Troy McGuinness rocked up and made a presentation, I think last year or maybe even the year before last, called CFDs Have to Die, I naturally was interested because that was rather a blow to something I believe quite strongly in. But Troy's got some very good points that are well worth taking. So Troy gets all the credit for the next few slides. But I think they make the point that we just need to rethink some of the things that we've come to hold onto quite dearly. So in his case, he just has a very simple CFD of completion work and work in progress. But actually, from that, it's quite difficult to see what's actually happening, week to week within the team. When you create a chart like that from that, that's the same data, just represented differently. You can begin to see that throughput, the blue one, is sort of relatively steady. The average cycle time was coming down, but now it's bounced up a bit. And the average WIP was highish and is now coming down. So you can, all of that data is in that picture there, but we can't process it. It's like, just cognitively, we can't take all of that data out of that and sort of really work with it. It's actually a bit simpler to see it like that. It's easier to see trends as well. So that's the throughput rate, and we can see that there's a general trend upwards. Now, you can't really see from here there's a general trend upwards to throughput rate, even though it's in the data. Likewise here, this is a really nice visualization, I think, which is showing WIP over time. And it's showing the range of WIP from, in a week, the lowest and the highest amount of items that were live during that week, and the average between them. And again, we can just a very slow trend of WIP going up. I don't know if any of you are coaches or Scrum Masters or, trying to get people to care about WIP in the first place and then sort of keep managing it and keep an awareness of it is really difficult. People just don't want to care that much about it. I'll talk about myself in this as well and our team. So that's work in progress. And this is another sort of very simple visualization. It goes to the mantra of stop starting, start finishing, which is a nice sort of lean phrase. And basically just, did we start more pieces of work this sprint than we finished, or did we finish more than we started? And again, it's just a simple awareness raising for the team and using data to visualize and raise that awareness. And with most of these charts, the point that I sort of come back to is that they don't provide you with answers. They hopefully get you asking the right questions. Why did we have this dip? Why have we sort of peaked here? Is there a pattern here? If there is a pattern, what's the root cause? If there isn't a pattern, are we missing something? It's that awareness raising that is really behind a lot of visualizations, gets you asking the right questions. So another visualization that's quite simple and useful is about backlogs. We're probably bored rigid by taking backlogs on either in TFS in that case or worse in spreadsheets and trying to engage business people with these backlogs. But what if we actually borrowed from the story mapping world of Jeff Patton and came up with a two-dimensional backlog? So we've got a backlog where time is written down the left-hand side. So that's our time. It could be sprints, it could be months, it could be iterations, releases, whatever. And how the business or the stakeholders see the backlog is along the top. In this case, we've used area paths, but you could use tags or other sort of features or whatever your business people sort of can recognize. And then in the colors of these, we've got the color represents the state of a piece of work, and the size represents its size. So very quickly, I've got a story here of, the work these are historical releases that we've done in the past. This is the current one in the middle, and these are ones in the future. And if I'm a stakeholder who's interested in that one or this one, I have quite a clear sense of where has the focus been in the past, where's it going, and we haven't written this bit yet, but if I also could take one of these PBIs or these user stories and move them into another grid, and like you would if you were on a board, wouldn't that be a wonderful way to maintain a backlog rather than just moving stuff up and down a bloody spreadsheet? So we've got these ideas knocking around within Agile. It's just sometimes a question of sort of bringing them together and actually utilizing them. I've done this talk a couple of times at meetups, one in London with about 60 people, and another one in Derby recently. And just we did an exercise where we drew up all the charts that people were using. And it's quite incredible how few charts people use. You know, burn up, burn down, that's about it. You know, there's not that much else. I mean, what other charts do we like to use? Do people have their favorites other than a burn up and a burn down and a CFD? Control chart, yeah. So distribution. Is that one that you take action based on that?
Yeah, sometimes. We actually use modified version of control chart.
Okay.
I visualize the size of work
Yeah.
by the size of the bubble.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I added that dimension there.
Yeah. I noticed you're from Shazam. I went to a really good talk from Shazam about 18 months ago, where you showed the cycle time of blockers.
Oh, right.
That,
was me presenting.
was it? Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I forgot that bit. It was at a meetup. Was it a meetup in London?
Yeah.
Was it? Okay, fine. Anyway, that was a wonderful chart, and it's on our backlog. We're going to do something like that. So, you know, how effective is a team? Well, how quickly is it removing blockers from its board? You know, do we even care about, do we record blockers? And are we getting better at removing blockers? And Shazam have a wonderful example of that. Good. So, the holy grail of project management. Again, a lot of this is, you know, with thanks to Troy McGuinness, is really, you know, when are we going to finish and what are we going to deliver if the time is limited. So what we've done is to build a Monte Carlo simulation, and just to explain how it works. We look at the project, so this is project specific. This team with this backlog over the last few weeks and months, how has their board been behaving? And we build a model, a mathematical model of that. And that model is looking at how long cards spent in each column. So we're looking at a frequency distribution there of how long cards spent in a column, sizes of cards, the amount of rework, whether they were blocked or not, and that's about it. So, you know, just 5 or 6 variables, and we build a model. And then we take the remainder of the backlog and we run it through the model 1,000 times. Every time we run it, we randomize elements of the board's behavior, the card's behavior, and so on. And each time we run it, it ends up in a different date. And if you map all those 1,000 end dates, they come up in a sort of normal distribution, as you'd probably expect. And then we use that to draw the throughput and the forecast of the scope. So we're beginning to pick up, and in these last few sort of weeks here maybe, we're beginning to find rework coming through, sort of bugs and rework. And we're beginning to sort of pick up on trends there, and we're building that into that. And then we can use that to forecast the end dates, and just like we did before. And that is really it. Except that, if we were to tell you that, you know, it would be quite a leap of faith for you to say, oh, well, I totally believe in Troy's, well, Monte Carlo goes way beyond Troy, but, you know, this whole idea of Monte Carlo and simulation of projects, and yes, that's very good. But one of the best aspects of this approach is that you can validate your model. You can actually go back and look at a project that finished last week, last month. And you can go and replay the model for that project based on, you know, 9 months ago or something like that. So that's what we did. So that's the chart I showed you earlier from a client of ours. So the project did finish in October last year. They shipped it. It went over to their client in the US. But the question we had was, if we took the data from, that's April last year, so finished in October, we're looking in April. If we took the data as it was in April and we ran it through the forecasting model, what dates does it show us? And it shows us that it will finish in a range. Now, this is one of the key things about probabilistic forecasting, which is what this is that we're always talking in ranges. We're always talking about a range of dates. And just that is actually quite a point of clarity with stakeholders, that we don't know whether we're going to hit the 30th of September, but here's the likelihood, here's some probabilities for you to work with. So that leaves space for conversation and exploring of options and so on. And then we ran it again and again and again, because that's the nice thing about mathematical models. You can just run them as often as you want, until we sort of, able to show. Now you can, naturally you'd expect that to sort of narrow in on a date with the more data you have and so on. We've run that with quite a few other projects in different clients with different types of teams and different types of backlogs and so on. And they're not always as good as that, but they're normally pretty accurate, pretty close to that. And back to that whole sort of soup of humanness that we were looking at earlier, here we are just using data. There's nothing else that's going into this mix. And for the first time possibly, the team begins to see that there's actually some benefit in the quality of their data and information and the way they're working, because one of the biggest stresses of teams is the death march that comes about when the business expectations and the team's capability or capacity are misaligned. The nice thing about this is that we're aligning expectations with team's capacity all through the project. We didn't sort of have a project manager promising the moon to stakeholders and have the team have to work weekends to deliver that. So there's real benefit, tangible benefit to a team to have their stakeholders aligned with what they're capable of and not being sold something that's not possible. So that's one way to use Monte Carlo, and it's a pretty powerful way. And again, it starts conversations going. There's no answers in that. It just starts you talking about things. But it injects that that bit of objectivity and rationality into the debate, which stimulates people into having the conversation. The other way that you use Monte Carlo is another sort of key question that stakeholders have of project teams, which is basically how far are we going to get in the next 8 weeks or for the next £200,000? We've got a backlog. What are we going to get for our £200,000? Now again, if we just leave this to the human to try and work this out, there's all sorts of biases at work, all sorts of risk avoidance strategies, all sorts of buying yourself a little bit of extra padding. If you run it through the model, you come up with a probability. So probably you're going to get everything above here. Let's say 95%, 90% probability, you're going to get everything above there. Possibly, we're going to get this far down. So again, 95% possibility we're going to get this far down the backlog. Now you as a business focus on the stuff that really matters, which is this stuff. There is not a lot of point talking about this stuff. You're almost certainly going to get it. We don't have to spend too much time convincing you that you're going to get it. There's not a lot of point talking about this stuff. You're almost certainly not going to get it. So, let go of that and we can go. Then, but what we're really focusing you on is this marginal functionality. Now again, these are difficult decisions for stakeholders and product owners to take. Any reason to avoid taking these difficult decisions, people are going to take that avoidance path. And that avoidance comes from things like vagueness, or back to that sort of soup of humanness. It's wishful thinking. Oh, I think we probably can. But when reality sort of smacks you and you're looking at it going, wow, you mean there's a chance I'm not going to get this thing? Really? Okay, well I'm off to start slicing up these and see if there's a way that I can reduce the size of these ones above here. And again, you could run this every week. The model you could run every day if you wanted to. And you could see how things are adjusting and how the picture's adjusting. So again, a very simple visual representation of a mathematical model. Now, I think what Troy was brilliant at was the whole sort of bringing this idea into Kanban and the Agile space and so on. But I think the bit that he's sort of left, in my opinion, is the translating it into something that you could then share. You could just pop in front of a stakeholder and say, look, have a look at this. We've got clients who just now use that burn-up chart, and that's what goes to the exec, because it has the essence of the communication in it. Forget RAG statuses, and again, referencing the first talk today. You don't know what to do with 5 pages of RAG statuses. But on that visualization, you have a pretty clear idea. We need to do something. And again, it starts you asking the questions of what should we do. So, just wrapping up, time's up. If you want to see more on SensorDAT, which is the product I was sort of showing a little bit of there, then we've got a website. If you want to talk about Monte Carlo and the whole idea of probabilistic forecasting, there's a good definition on the web, but Troy's YouTube intro into it is brilliant. I totally recommend that. And reading Roy's blog on focusedobjective.com. And if you want to email me, I'm Bazil, and you can tweet me too. So that's it. Thank you very much.